So there's been so much politics this week, guys, but we really do want to concentrate on the Rwanda scheme because that is probably the most significant sort of policy story that we've had this week. But before we go into it, we've got to talk about last night's ceasefire vote because it was the biggest rebellion that Keir Starmer has faced as Labour leader. And 56 Labour MPs defied the party line to vote for a ceasefire in Gaza. And that led to 10 MPs actually resigning from their front bench positions, probably the most prominent being Jess Phillips. A, because she's a well-known politician, Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence. She's been on the front bench a while. But also B, because she is not from the Socialist Campaign Group. She's not a left-wing MP in the sense of, the sort of old Corbynites might be described. So it suggests there's, more going on than a rebellion against Keir Starmer on factional lines.
Yeah, completely. But we did know that these dividing lines were already there. This has been bubbling around for 2 or 3 weeks now. This was the first time in the House of Commons that we've had such an explicit vote on it. So it was expected that so many people would rebel. But the other thing I think that is worth noting is that because we've had this now, I think there's a chance it will probably die down. People have expressed their opinion. They can say to their constituents, look, when it came up, I voted in this way. And Keir Starmer can say that we've not U-turned. So I don't think it's as bad for Keir Starmer as some people are necessarily portraying, particularly because if it does settle down, there's a big chance of people returning to the front benches. You've got to remember that there's a very small cohort of MPs that Starmer actually can pick from for the front bench. So he hasn't got that many people. So I think it's likely that both he and those who have resigned will probably want to return to their previous arrangement.
Yeah, because some of them had actually already resigned. So I was looking at some of the names. Dan Carden, who's a PPS. He resigned over the Spy Cops vote a few years ago now.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll want to be in government. It's the first time that Labour's going to be in government for 13 years and they won't want to miss out on that opportunity. So, I don't think we should overrate how bad this is for Keir Starmer. It's obviously not great for his authority, but they have been sacked. So he stuck to his word on that. They haven't called for him to resign. So, if you look at Jess Phillips's resignation letter, it's very clear that she supports Keir Starmer and she will support
It's very measured,
It's very measured. Yeah. It's very specific.
Very much this is a conscience issue.
Exactly,
for
it's
her
very
and her
specific. And John McDonnell made this point last night on ITV as well. This is almost a one-off, and that's how Lotto have been framing it behind the scenes for a few weeks now. If we can separate out these issues, and maybe, John McDonnell was saying maybe this should have been a free vote, as he thinks other sort of moral issues should be in the House of Commons. So if it is restricted to the issue of Gaza rather than bleeding into issues of tax or benefits or whatever it is, then I don't think it's too much of a problem for Keir Starmer.
Well, that's the thing that I thought might just end up being a problem, because they often say, don't they, politicians, that once you rebel, it's so much easier to rebel again, especially if you don't have a front bench position, so less to lose. And I noticed in your piece about the Oxford councillors who resigned over this issue that some of them were also mentioning the 2-child benefit cap and sort of framing this as, well, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. So, there could be, for some of these MPs who are not ideologically aligned to Starmer, there could be other chances for them to rebel, although, admittedly, it's not a huge block. Yeah,
though it's different for councillors just because they're not or dangled government jobs in front of them, and the whipping operation doesn't work in the same way. And I also think that if it is just restricted to Corbynites, then it's not that big a problem for Keir Starmer. He's been very clear that he doesn't want Corbynites to necessarily be part of his project if they're going to profess the views that they used to. And if that just happens again, I think that's fine.
I think the point about being on the cusp of being in government is a really key one. I think you've got to remember that the kind of person who wants to be an MP, wants to go into politics, you do that because the vast majority of them, you have an eye to one day being in government and one day being a minister and one day possibly being in the cabinet and maybe even being prime minister one day. I mean, that is kind of, to go into politics and have a political career, you have to sort of have that as your ambition, even if lots of them say that they don't. And for Labour, 13 years in the wilderness, now looking like they are going to win that election and the chance of actually being in government and having a chance to make a real difference, it's right there. If you're the kind of person who has gone into politics with that ambition, are you going to completely throw away all of your chances over something which you might feel very passionately about, but isn't going to have any kind of impact. I mean, nobody is suggesting that Israel and Hamas, neither of which want a ceasefire, are looking to what the Labour Party in the UK says about it. Like, it's not going to have real-world impact.
Thankfully for Starmer, actually, the Rwanda ruling has sort of pushed this off the top of the headlines. The government seems to be very good at snatching the news agenda, just as the opposition is looking wobblier than it has been in recent months. So you've had this. I mean, the government actually met its target on halving inflation before the end of the year this week. It's easy to remember that because of all of the news, the fallout from the reshuffle, Suella Braverman's letter, which we'll get onto later. But let's talk about this Rwanda ruling, because it was quite comprehensive, wasn't it? It was a unanimous ruling that the Rwanda plan, which is to deport asylum seekers coming to the UK to Rwanda to be processed and then to stay, that's illegal. And actually, we've not had such a comprehensive decision on this in the courts, even though it's been through legal battles before. So last December, the High Court ruled the plan was lawful. And then after an appeal, the Court of Appeal ruled in June 2-1 that it was unlawful. And now the Supreme Court has unanimously said that it's unlawful. So that's quite a bad outcome for the government, which I think was hoping for a more caveated ruling.
Yeah, I think certainly if you take Suella Braverman's word for it, the government was hoping and expecting that they would win this, or they would lose it less comprehensively. I think two things to keep in mind about it. The court wasn't ruling, and they were very, very clear about this. Lord Reid, who gave the judgment, was very clear. It was not ruling on the concept, the principle of can you send asylum seekers to a third country and process them there. And that as a principle is fine. It was specifically on can you send them to Rwanda? Is Rwanda a safe country to have that kind of agreement with? And specifically, can you be sure that Rwanda's immigration systems and asylum seeker processing systems and facilities and institutions and courts are robust enough to ensure that they don't get sent back to their country of origin.
Yes, because it was finding that Rwanda was rejecting applications from people who had fled from Syria and
Afghanistan. So 95% of those who came from Syria, Afghanistan, they were rejecting. That is. It's a very large technicality, but that is a technicality. And if the government's strategy was we want people to know that if they come to the UK, they could be sent away and processed somewhere else. And crucially, not just processed somewhere else, but even if their claim is upheld, then they get asylum in that third country rather than in Britain. Conceptually, the court went, that's fine, but not Rwanda.
Yeah. And so, Freddie, what does this mean for the government? How disappointing is this? Because I suppose there is that sort of chink of optimism that the idea of the third country model for asylum processing isn't out of the question legally.
Yeah, so the government could respond in two ways, I think. They could say that we're going to ignore all of the legal frameworks that require the UK not to send people to places that could then return them to the original country.
Say the word.
The refoulement, I think it is. Refoulement. That's the legal principle.
Refool me once.
She's like, morning call, Anoosh, come on, you're too late. So that's the principle that prevents the government from doing that. The problem with the discourse at the moment within the Conservative Party is that principle is contained in many different legal frameworks. It's not just the ECHR, it's also the UN Convention on Torture, it's the UN Covenant on Civil Rights, Civil and Political Rights. It's also included in domestic law. There's an Immigration Act from 1993 that it's included in. There's one from the noughties as well. It's also in the HRA, so in the Human Rights Act. So it's contained both within international frameworks and in domestic law. So if the government did want to basically rescind its obligations, its legal obligations under all of those frameworks, it would have to go through them one by one. So that's part of the problem, and that's part of the problem with just saying, why can't we leave the ECHR and then we'll be able to deport people to Rwanda? So the second option, therefore, is can you try and help the Rwandan government improve their systems so there isn't this risk about sending them to the original country? James Cleverly was on the radio this morning suggesting that's essentially their plan. It's worth noting that the problems with the Rwandan system that the court highlighted are quite serious. So, for instance, the Rwandan system at all levels, apart from the top one, includes government officials, which makes it obviously not very objective. At the top, you have the High Court, where the appeal can eventually go to. That's never been used since it was set up in 2018. So there's no justification or evidence that there's a sort of impartial judicial process that happens in Rwanda. So that's one of the concerns. There are other concerns, as you pointed to, about the fact that Israel and Rwanda have had schemes in the past, and there has been refoulement there. So there's lots of evidence to suggest that the Rwandan immigration system isn't set up in a way that allows it to do this. Now, the question is, can that be improved going forward? The government are confident it is. The reason I think that would be tricky is because the government doesn't have time to do that. Remember, we've got the election in the next 12 months or so. Can they improve the system with Rwanda? Can they pass this new treaty? Can they get planes sent away within 6 months?
Yeah, well, I thought this was really interesting because Robert Jenrick, the immigration minister, explicitly said that this could have an electoral impact if they don't get flights off by spring, which I think is quite weird. I think it's weird that they're being explicit about one of the main reasons for this policy, to win an election, rather than the kind of, because they're trying to make a moral argument from it. James Cleverly, the new Home Secretary, was speaking this morning about the morality of having schemes like this. So it's quite odd that they're so transparent about the fact that this is literally, they're putting stop the boats on lecterns to try and attract some votes from their base.
Well, at least they're being honest. And also they're clear that this is what the public wants. That's their populist argument. This is what the public wants. We have to deliver it.
Conversely, electorally, you've also seen suggestions that if they could call an early election on the basis of this, make it explicit. Let's go to the people again in the same way as Boris went to the people for get Brexit done. Let's go to the people for get Rwanda done. The polling on this, it's a really complicated issue. And the problem with polling it is that the principle of stopping illegal channel crossings, that has high popularity. When it comes to Rwanda, it depends how you ask it. If you ask, should the government basically ignore international law, then the majority of people say, no, it should do everything that it can within the law. I think it was about 19 to 20% of people polled said that it should do anything, including ignoring international law, which is sort of what Lee Anderson, one of our favourites at the New Statesman, the deputy chair of the Conservative Party, suggested. So it is one of those issues where some people argue, the public really want the Rwanda scheme to take off. And actually, if you look at the polling, it's a bit more nuanced than that. And the problem is that the government, Rishi Sunak, has done a really, really good job over the last year of highlighting illegal channel crossings, how many boats are coming, how much of an issue it is. It's got lots of publicity. It's often on the front pages. Now there's an internal row over Suella Braverman and the wings of the party over it. So great, well done. You've highlighted the problem. You've also highlighted the fact that the government can't solve it or hasn't been able to solve it. So there is a danger that the more attention you put on this, look at how hard we're working to make sure that the Rwanda scheme happens, that gets read as, hang on, you're the government, why haven't you fixed it already?
Yeah, and so what has Rishi Sunak's response been? Because he called this press conference in the afternoon to respond to the Supreme Court's ruling, and he was hinting that they may have to, pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights if it came to it.
But first they're going to pass a law. They're going to pass a law that says Rwanda is safe.
Well, explain that.
So there's two parts. Yeah. So they're going to try and get a treaty with Rwanda, which is legally binding, which requires Rwanda not to send people back to their original country. That's the first part. That's to address the concern that Rwanda, because their system isn't well set up, will inevitably send people where places that they shouldn't be. The second part, which is the interesting part, which is also the slightly ludicrous part, is that they have said they're going to pass a law to just simply declare Rwanda a safe place.
Which could face challenges in the Lords. If they tried to pass that emergency legislation. Jonathan Sumption,
who isn't exactly the classic enemy.
No. Usually he's on sort of the Conservative side. Has been like, laws aren't magic. You can't just pass a law and change the facts.
Yeah, he called it constitutionally bizarre or something. They're just declaring the world to be in a way that they want it to be. It is remarkable. I don't know how that would then work legally, I assume there would be lots of legal challenges to it, and then you get back into the original problem of not being able to send off flights full of migrants because it's all jammed up in the courts. So they are in a bit of a bind, but I don't know whether the question with this is often, is it just about proving that you're trying to do something? I'm not sure that necessarily suffices anymore, because the boats, they do keep coming and people are getting angrier and angrier. Yeah. And then I think there's also a sense within the party that this system, this legal international system within which these policies are made, does have to change. And Neil O'Brien just said, I think he said last night, there's not just one thing that needs fixing, though we do need to start by overriding the Human Rights Act. You can't just tweak a treaty, he says. This needs to be an overhauling of the whole system itself. So does the Conservative Party want to do that, if it wants to actually set up this policy properly, or does it want to get gummed up in the courts week after week? 'Cause it does seem as if Rishi Sunak doesn't want to leave the ECHR. We've seen, I think, since he came in, a much greater respect for international law than his predecessors. Obviously, that's a low bar, but he, I think, probably would have said he wanted to leave if he did, because that's what his party wants him to do.
Yeah, and he has surrounded himself now with senior ministers who have been on the record saying that they don't want to do that. So you've got James Cleverly, David Cameron would not be keen on that, I don't think. And you've Alex Chalk, I think, was talking about the importance of the rule of law as well. He's the Justice Secretary. So it would, be quite difficult for them to cross that Rubicon. But it does seem like they are sort of on the inevitable march to saying they want to leave some of our domestic and international human rights and refugee obligations, which, to be fair, could be the future that we're looking at in all of Europe. So not all of Europe, but in other European countries as well, because Denmark's explored a similar Rwanda scheme. Yeah. Italy, Germany and Austria all looking at those third country models. They're all going to come under pressure from either, further right parties in their countries, but also perhaps the public, to leave some of these frameworks, which, some of them were written up quite a long time ago. You've got MPs like Neil O'Brien saying that they need change. I mean, is this an international future that we're looking at?
Well, it's a global crisis, and one of the downsides of fixating on is Rwanda going to work, are we going to leave the ECHR, is that you miss the global context, which is the most European countries. The problem is, the challenge is even worse there. They take vastly more numbers of refugees and also have similar debates going on in their politics. Italy, Giorgia Meloni is very focused on this issue. There is lots of talk with the EU about working with countries like Albania, Turkey. It's more of an issue for the countries in Southern Europe, Italy, Greece. This isn't going away. And that's why the kind of quite myopic British view of let's just send them back to France misses the point that France is also facing these challenges, and to a higher extent than Britain is. Labour's approach to this, or what they've said they'll do, is focus more on tackling the problem at source. So working with other countries on trafficking gangs, trafficking routes. You've also got to have a conversation about legal routes to the UK, which we've talked about. Like, one of the things that gets missed is that the majority of people who cross the channel illegally, so they have made illegal crossings, then get their asylum seeker applications upheld. They are genuine asylum seekers, and maybe they wouldn't make those illegal crossings if there were legal ways for them to come to the country and claim asylum, which nobody ever wants to talk about. And then there's also the issue. But it is
in the illegal migration bill. Legal routes are in that bill.
It is in the illegal migration bill, but it hasn't actually happened. Yeah, they said we will explore.
They will bring it in after they've stopped any channel crossings, which, some would argue that it actually has to be the other way around. To stop. Yeah.
And then there's the issue of offshoring, just the processing of it, which is different to the Rwanda scheme, which is you can process applications without people being in Britain. Right now, you have to physically be in the UK to have your asylum claim processed in the UK. So, lots of countries are looking at it. They're trying to explore different mechanisms. They're facing the same challenges. But it seems pretty obvious that if you want any kind of long-term solution, it has to be working with other countries, not just going, we're an island, we can put up a big fence.
Yeah, though to be fair, the government have been very focused on working with many other countries. The diplomacy with Europe has been much greater in the past year. The focus on cooperation with Albania, France, Italy is much greater than it was.
They're doing the work, but they don't talk about the fact that they're actually the effective stuff that they're doing. They always talk about Rwanda instead. It's totemic.
Yeah, and then just on the inevitable path that we might now be on with the ECHR, if you do set up this battle, and if we do have quite clearly written down in a Supreme Court judgment that one of the key reasons that this policy can't work is this international legal framework,
Yes.
well, then, okay, in 5 years' time, in the same way that we had this sort of snowball effect with the EU, are we going to inevitably have the Conservative Party calling for our derogation or our leaving of these international
because, David
frameworks?
Cameron, who people see now as a Remainer, I mean, he spoke in Eurosceptic terms for a very long time, which built this idea in the public imagination of Europe being some kind of blocker to the UK's priorities and sovereignty. And I can see this similar thing happening. I know you're right, Sunak doesn't seem keen to do it, but he's hinting at it quite a lot all the time. Yeah,
you give momentum, and if you fight the issue, that you inevitably work out what the problem is. I think, again, we must say that one of the problems, the key problem here is, as you said, Rachel, is with Rwanda and their actual state infrastructure, and that's the key problem here. But the background is all of these legal agreements that the UK has signed up to and negotiated and promoted around the world for the past 50, 60 years.
Yeah, and someone who would be keen to leave and someone who actually predicted the outcome of the Supreme Court ruling was Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary.
Talk about the letter.
And we haven't managed to speak about the letter. We talked about the fact that she was sacked from government in our emergency reshuffle podcast. But why don't we go through some of the sort of most eviscerating things in this quite extraordinary letter? It wasn't a resignation letter. It was just a letter she sent to Sunak following her departure from government.
Parting letter.
It was
a parting shot, really.
It was very much you're not breaking up with me, I'm breaking up with you letter.
So she said, you've manifestly and repeatedly failed to deliver on every single one of these key policies. And there she's talking about this supposed deal that she made with him when she gave him her support, remember, during that sort of second slight Tory leadership campaign after Liz Truss's government failed. Apparently he promised to pass these key policy areas in order to get her support and for her to come in and be Home Secretary. Reduce legal migration, as set out in the manifesto. That's been a long-standing Tory policy. Includes specific clauses into new legislation to stop the boats. So everything we've been talking about here about the ECHR, the Human Rights Act, to try and ignore these laws and get that policy passed. And then the Northern Ireland Protocol and retained EU law bills in their existing form and timetable to deliver that. Obviously, they ditched the retained EU law bill. And unequivocal statutory guidance to schools that protects biological sex, and actually teachers are still waiting for guidance on that. So there's quite a few things here that have fallen by the wayside. If we trust the fact that Sunak did assure Braverman that these would be his priorities, then, she's suggesting that he's broken his word to her.
No, she's suggesting that he's broken his word to the country. And you get that word betrayal both of her and of the people who voted in 2019 for the Conservative Party. So it actually reminded me a little bit of Nadine Dorries' resignation letter over the summer, which was her standing down as an MP, but really emphasising Sunak's lack of mandate either from voters across the country or from Conservative members. If you look at those four priorities, I don't think this is aimed at Sunak. This is a leadership campaign in waiting, because actually the issue of guidance to schools and biological sex, that's not something that Suella Braverman has talked a huge amount about. That's not, she's talked about protests and she's talked about law and order, and you talked in the podcast earlier about how her comments on people rough sleeping and living in tents being a lifestyle choice, that kind of provocative language being one of the triggers for Sunak's decision to sack her. I'm not saying she doesn't believe that, but that is very clearly aimed at garnering support of a wing of the party for whom that is a really, really crucial issue. And she didn't need to send this letter. Certainly, usually letters, it's 2.5 pages. Like, usually resignation letters or letters from MPs, ministers who've been sacked are not that long. It's the manifesto document for what comes next.
Yeah, and one of the remarkable things is that she says there's a document with all of this written down on, so that she and Rishi Sunak got together, wrote a document, agreed on it. They almost make it sound as if they signed this
She says,
contract,
our
which
deal
we agreed.
was not a mere promise over dinner to be discarded when convenient and denied when challenged. I think that's a reference to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's agreement over dinner. But I think what's that phrase? Provide the receipts. See the receipts. I have the receipts.
Yeah. And it sounds like she really has been putting everything in writing, because she's saying how often she sort of wrote to him about a credible plan B for the Rwanda scheme if the Supreme Court ruled it unlawful. And so I think, we might end up seeing some of these messages that she sent to him and this contract that she hints at.
Yeah, there have been briefings in the paper this week suggesting that she has this sort of dossier of stuff on Rishi Sunak that she might release. I just think it's interesting that her and Sunak are not actually that far apart on some of these things.
Yeah.
We touched on this on Monday.
Yeah, we did.
The points that she's making are actually quite technical points about legislation, like the fact that she thinks that we should have notwithstanding clauses in Stop the Boats legislation. Okay, that's very important because it's about whether or not you abide by the international frameworks we were talking about earlier. However, the objective is still the same. I don't think we can doubt Rishi Sunak's desire to stop the boat. He's literally pitched his whole leadership on this key issue, and that's one of the reasons that the Supreme Court judgment is so important, because it's just taking the legs out of something that he spent months and months and months both promoting and also working on. So whether she can say to her colleagues in the party, look, come with me, we can go and fight this battle, well, they might just say, okay, well, Rishi's already fighting this battle and you've got some opinions on it as well. So this is one of the reasons that I don't think the rebellion necessarily will be as big as some people have been talking about in the past few days.
The other issue with it is that she was Home Secretary while he failed on all of these things. And the trigger for her writing this letter is obviously him sacking her. But you could argue, and there are some who are supportive of these policies but not a massive fan of her as an individual, who kind of went, like, if there was this agreement and you could see him breaking it, the fact that you're only talking about it now when he sacked you doesn't make you look amazingly good.
And timing is remarkable, isn't it? Imagine if she was still in post when the Supreme Court judgment was read out yesterday. She would have been the one responsible and arguably attacked by the Supreme Court or undermined by the Supreme Court. But just because she got sacked 3 days or 2 days before, she's able to release this letter and claim to be this prophet. Exactly. It's remarkable. I wonder the question, therefore, is why did Number 10 not wait until afterwards? Maybe because she would have resigned in the same way and said, I said this would happen. But it's remarkable that she's not been tainted with the judgment in the same way that Sunak has.
See, I think the opposite, actually. Yeah. I think that
she would have been a Rwanda martyr.
Yeah, exactly. And that this letter would have had more force as an actual resignation letter. Yeah. I am quitting your government because I do not... The judgment went the way I told you it would go, and I don't trust you to come up with a credible plan B, and so I am resigning. This, I read it, and obviously it's explosive. I don't think we've seen a resignation letter quite like this since the last time she resigned from a government, which was when Liz Truss sacked her, and she wrote this very pointed letter about, what was it? I made a mistake. I take responsibility for my actions. I have resigned. Which obviously was a comment on the Liz Truss leadership. But I think it has much less force coming in between her being sacked and this judgment. And to go back to the fact that she was sacked last week, there was lots of briefing about if he dared to sack her, then a whole load of allies would stand down and there would be this huge rebellion. And the right wing are angry. They're very, very, very angry. But we haven't seen resignations. We've seen one public letter of no confidence in Rishi Sunak. We've seen another letter from the New Conservatives basically saying, we're not very happy with you, but we're still going to stay in the party. And you had this, and it just comes across as a bit desperate, it lacks the authority that I think it would have had if it was an actual resignation letter after the Supreme Court ruling, rather than a letter having been sacked before it.
I agree. And it's not as if Rishi Sunak had the support of all these people last week.
Yeah.
This is not new. The party has been divided for years now, Rishi Sunak's not been able to pursue his policies because of those divisions. He's not been able to pursue housing policy, immigration policy has been up in the air. We know this is what's defining the Conservative Party at the moment. Just because we've got a Supreme Court judgment on the Rwanda deal doesn't mean it's anything new.
Okay, and we should say that since this letter came out, Braverman has actually come out saying that Rishi Sunak's alternative plan for the Rwanda deal also doesn't cut it. So we'll keep an eye on that. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.